again. I took a call. I'm sorry. Okay, picking back up. Indian ideas were probably not much known in the West at that stage, but over the next 1,000 years or so, the atomistic ideas of the Greeks kept being revised by various Arab and European thinkers and kept being vigorously opposed to by the Christian Church. In fact, for reasons that are not entirely clear, the Paris Parliament went so far in 1624 as to decree that any person maintaining or teaching atomism or any other doctrine contrary to Aristotle would be put to death. 1624 is quite late. Interesting. Despite this somewhat heavy-handed approach, or knowing scientists perhaps even because of it, atomism became the dominant theory of matter from around 1630 onwards. Between 1646 and 1691, at least 7 European scientists, including Boyle, Leeuwenhoek, Newton, and Halley, made or discussed experimentally based estimates of an upper limit for the size of atoms. Huygens even put forward a comprehensive quantitative theory based on atomic motion, which he applied to gravitation, atmospheric pressure, light as waves of particle vibrations, and cohesion. Newton proposed a corpuscular theory of light. What a strange word. Corpuscular. I love it. Corpuscular. With the motion of the corpuscles being guided by waves, in somewhat stunning anticipation of the latest theories on the nature of light. However, this enthusiasm for atomism waned again, and in the 18th century was a relatively quiet period in the history of the idea. It was not until the chemists of the 19th century appeared on the scene that modern scientific atomism was reborn. By 1807, a good deal of experimentation in the emerging field of chemistry had produced the rather grandly named law of definite proportions, which stated that for any given chemical compound, the constituent elements are always combined in the same proportions by weight, however the compound is made. A hypothesis explaining this was now proposed by Francis Dalton, who therefore became known among chemists as the father of atomism. Dalton suggested that A. There are distinct, invisible atoms. B. That those of any given element are alike in weight, and those of different elements have different weights. And C. That atoms combined in simple whole number ratios to form compounds. While these were not ideas of any great originality, they were a clear set of experimentally testable postulates about the existence of nature and atoms, which, in light of another couple of centuries of experimentation, we know were not all completely correct. The postulates were generated to explain scientific experimental observations, and they were immediately tested against more experimental observations. There is a great deal more to the history of atomism, but this much will suffice to make a couple of important points. The basic idea that matter is composed of atoms arose at least twice in ancient philosophy, and the eventual scientific evolution version of the atomic theory was generated to explain specific experimental data. How can we use these insights in the construction of a theory of consciousness? It is probably fair to say that at the close of the 20th century, we are in rather worse position with regard to a theory of consciousness than we were pre-Dalton chemists of the 19th century with regard to a theory of matter. That is to say, we have a large volume of experimental data, but really no simple universal idea that ties it all together in a satisfactory way. So, by analogy with the atomic theory, perhaps we should look to the ancient philosophies of India and Greece for such an idea. Ancient views about consciousness. On the nature of matter, we have seen that both the ancient Greeks and the ancient Hindus developed a very specific and time showed substantially correct theory. On the nature of consciousness, however, it turns out that the Indian tradition has far more to say than the Greek. The three basic texts in the Vedic tradition of India are the Upanishads. I'm going to butcher these. I am so sorry. The Upanishads, the Bhagavad Gita, and the Brahma Sutra. Remarkably, in view of their differing and sometimes fiercely argued views on other issues, all of these texts hold the same view of the nature of consciousness. This is that the world ground, the soul and whole cause of the world and universal self, of which our individual selves are only parts, is an all-pervading, pure consciousness or intelligence. This is called Brahman, or the Brahma Sutra, and the Bhagavad Gita. And either Brahman or Atman in those books of the Upanishads where it is mentioned, namely the Brajaranyaka Upanishad and the Isa Upanishad. I am so sorry. Pure consciousness, that is, consciousness without any object or subject. Is held to not be an attribute of Atman or Brahman, but its essence. Various meditative techniques are presented more or less clearly in the various works, by use of which it is said to be possible to obtain direct experience of this field of pure consciousness, as it is routinely translated from Sanskrit. Such experience is reported to be the ultimate bliss, beyond which nothing else could ever be desired. Apart from blissfulness, the main characteristic of the universal consciousness is that it is all-pervading. So I think that this is talking about the ideas of mindfulness, that when you meditate in certain ways and develop a certain stream of consciousness and concentration, that you can develop this freedom from desire and freedom from dissatisfaction, which is enlightenment, or the bliss that she's talking about. And that the universal consciousness is all-pervading. There certainly is thought that the body is a vessel for consciousness as opposed to like consciousness originating in the body. We see this in several different trains of thought. Like the Sufism, where they spin that the breath, we are like a reed or an instrument that we empty ourselves in order to feel the breath of consciousness or the breath of enlightenment, which is quite a lovely metaphor. We see this, we can experience this by meditating and really focusing on awareness. and having these certain guided experiences and thoughts. So I resonate very, very clearly with what she's saying here and what is written in the Vedic texts. Okay, let us move on now to the notions on consciousness propounded by the ancient Greek philosophers. Plato is uniformly regarded as being one of the greatest of these, and although we have just seen he did get it wrong when it came to atomism, it turns out that he may have been more successful on the matter of consciousness. In fact, it has been suggested, with considerable textual justification, that Plato independently discovered a technique which allowed him to experience what the Vedic tradition calls Brahman. This technique is poorly described in Plato's writings. Oh, Plato. As indeed are the meditation techniques in the Vedas. Meditation is something that's kind of difficult to write down, because you could say it in one sentence, focus on the breath, but at the same time, there's so much more that's going on. Yeah. And it has hitherto been regarded by modern philosophers as pretty much incomprehensible. Oh, Plato. The name given to it by Plato is generally translated from the Greek as the dialectic. As a result of using his dialectic, Plato described transcendental experiences of what he calls the good, the beautiful, or true being, which bear startling resemblance to the Vedic descriptions of the experience of Brahman. Plato's theory of forms is tied to this transcendental after-death realm, in which experience first of what he calls an open sea of beauty, and then of eternal oneness, an inviolable whole, simply pure, unbounded loveliness itself, is taken as being the experience of the form of beauty. Plato's best-known pupil was Aristotle. While Aristotle was sharply critical of his teacher's theory of forms in general and rejected their independent existence, he did make an exception in the case of the form he variously called active intelligence, the unmoved mover, the good, and God. Aristotle's doctrine of psychological hylomorphism posits the psyche as being the form of the body, and is presented by Aristotle as a genuine alternative to both reductive materialism and dualism. It can be interpreted in a number of different ways, but inasmuch as the modern notion of a field of physics is in some sense physical but not material, it is perhaps reasonable to suggest that Aristotle's hylomorphic notions with regard to consciousness could be read in terms of some sort of field. It must be admitted this is a tenuous interpretation, and it is not clear whether it was one intended by Aristotle himself, but then the whole idea of a field, in the sense in which modern physics uses the term, was unknown at the time. Aristotle's best-known hypothesis about consciousness is that there exists a common sense, which has the function of integrating information from the 5 specific senses into a unified perception of the world. Again, Aristotle did not specifically suggest that this common sense had the properties of a field, possibly because of the concept of a field in this sense arose only with Faraday and James Clerk Maxwell in the 19th century. However, as we will see in later chapters, a field would certainly have the properties of the common sense. In summary, there is some lack of clarity here, and the above interpretations are not at this stage standard among contemporary scholars. Greek thought may in general terms be read as being similar to Vedic thought on the subject of consciousness, just as it was on the subject of matter. In both Vedic and Platonic thought, it is held that some gifted or well-trained individuals are capable of directly experiencing an unbounded field of consciousness that is a pure consciousness without any contents in term of thought or sensory experiences, and b, essentially infinite in time and space, or at any rate larger than the normal waking individual consciousness, which seems to be confined inside an individual's head. So I'm going to diverge from the reading material here and talk just a little bit about this theory of consciousness. She talks in the preface, which I did not read to you, about the two current trains of thought on, or maybe she will. No, I believe that it is in the preface that there are currently two trains of thought on the nature of consciousness, that it is materialistic, coming purely from the neurochemical interactions in the brain and the structures of the brain, very materially founded. And then there's another train of thought called dualism. I will find it. One moment. Yes, dualism. So the consciousness is a non-material experience, coming from somewhere else, some other experience, some other part of the universe, or interaction with the universe. Anywho, that's all for now. Ciao, Bella.